In our long diaspora, we have learned not to tattle on our hosts. Goldie's right hand, shaken farewell, was unreally soft. Bech saved page 17 for the last. The Times Review was headlined, "More Ethnic Fiction from the New World," and lumped the best of Bech with a novel about Canadian Indians by Leonard Cohen and a collection of protest essays and scatological poems by Leroy Jones. The long Observer piece was titled "Bech's Best, Not Good Enough," and was signed L. Clark Tuttle. Bech skimmed as a fakir walks on hot coals, pausing nowhere long enough to burn the moisture from the soles of his feet. Almost none of the quotes he had poured into the boy's notebook and tape recorder were used. Instead, an aggrieved survey of Bech's oeuvre unfolded, smudged by feeble rebuttals. Queried concerning the flowery, not to say fruity, style of The Chosen, Bech shrugged off the entire problem of style, claiming, facetiously, that he never thinks about it. Of the book's profound failure, the crippling irreconcilability of its grandiose intentions, and the triviality of its characters' moral concerns, Bech appears blissfully unaware, taking refuge in the charming, if rather automatically gnomic, disclaimer that as you grow older, life becomes complicated. This interviewer was struck indeed by the defensive nature of Bech's breezy garrulousness. His charm operates as a screen against others, their menacing opinions, the raw stuff of their life, just as perhaps drink operates within him as a screen against his own deepest self-suspicions. Counter-revolutionary nostalgia, possibly ironical faith in entrepreneurism. Nevertheless, undoubted verbal gifts. Traumatized by the economic collapse of the 1930s, a minor master for the space of scattered pages, not to be classed, Bech's faithful New York Review clack to the contrary, with the early bellow or the late mailer, reminded in the end, after the butterfly similes and overextended, substanceless themes of this self-anointed best of, and the comparison may serve English readers as an index of present relevance, Ronald Furbank. Bech let the paper go limp. The airplane had taxied out, and he braced himself for the perilous plunge into flight. Only when aloft, with Hampton Court securely beneath him, a delicate sepia diagram of itself, and London's great stone mass dissolved into a cloud behind him, did Bech turn to page 17. A column there was headed Marissa's Week. The line drawing of the girl reminded Bech erotically of the spaces in her face, the cat-like span between her eyes, the painted circles of her cheeks, the sudden moist gap of her mouth, which in the caricature existed as a wry tilde. Marissa had a tamey week. The daffodils were just like old times, eh, WW? Beware, the blackjack dealer at L'Ambassadeur draws to 15 and always makes it. A verger down at Canterbury Sea is such an ignoramus I took him for a drug squad agent. The new acoustics in Albert Hall are still worse than those on Salisbury Plain. John and Oko will cut their next record standing on their heads, their bottoms painted to resemble each other. Swinging L was a shade more swingy this week when the darling American author Henry Travel Light Brother Pig and Don't Look Blank There in Penguins Bech dropped in at Revolution and other in spots. The heart of many a jaded bird beat brighter to see Bech's rabbinical curls bouncing in time to Poke Salad Annie and other now hits. Marissa says, hurry back, HB. Transatlantic men are the most existential. He was visiting Londinium to help push la creme of his creme, Bech's Best, a J.J. Goldschmidt release, with a dull, dull jacket. The author's pick is missing. Confidentially, his heart belongs to dirty old New York. Bech closed his eyes, feeling his love for her expand as the distance between them increased. Entrepreneurism rides again. Rabbinical curls. Somehow he had sold her that. Automatically gnomic. He had sold that too. as a screen against others. Furbank dead at 40. Still gaining altitude, he realized he was not dead. His fate was not so substantial. He had become a character by Henry Bech. Bech enters heaven. When Henry Bech was an impressionable pre-adolescent of 13, more bored than he would admit with the question of whether or not the 1936 Yankees could wrest the pennant back from Detroit, his mother one May afternoon took him out of school after consultation with the principal. She was a hardened consulter with the principal. She had consulted when Henry entered the first grade, when he came back from the second with a bloody nose, when he skipped the third, when he was given a 65 in penmanship in the fifth, and when he skipped the sixth. The school was PS 87 at 77th and Amsterdam, a bleak brick building whose interior complexity of smells and excitement, especially during a snowstorm or around Halloween, was transcendent. None but very young hearts could have withstood the daily strain of so much intrigue, humor, desire, personality, mental effort, emotional current, of so many achingly important nuances of prestige and impersonation. Bech, rather short for his age, yet with a big nose and big feet that promised future growth, was recognized from the first by his classmates as an only son, a mother's son more than a father's, pampered and bright, though not a prodigy. His voice had no pitch. His mathematical aptitude was no Einstein's. Naturally, he was teased. Not all the teasing took the form of bloody noses. Sometimes the girl in the adjacent desk seat tickled the hair on his forearms with her pencil, or his name was flaunted through the wire fence that separated the sexes at recess. The brownstone neighborhoods that supplied students to the school were in those years still middle class, if by middle class is understood not a level of poverty. Unlike today's poor, they had no cars, no credit and delivery arrangements with the liquor store, but of self-esteem. Immersed in the Great Depression, they had kept their families together, kept their feet from touching bottom, and kept their faith in the future, their children's future more than their own. These children brought a giddy relief into a sanctum of the school building, relief that the world, or at least this brick cube carved from it, had survived another day. How fragile the world felt to them, as fragile as it seems sturdy to today's children who wish to destroy it. Predominantly Jewish, Bech's grammar school classes had a bold, bright dash of German Gentiles, whose fathers also kept a small shop or plied a manual craft, and some Eastern Europeans whose fey manners and lisped English made them the centers of romantic frenzy and wild, joking attacks. At this time, Negroes, like Chinese, were exotic oddities created like zebras in jest. All studied by the light of yellowish overhead globes and of the 48-star flag nailed above the blackboard, penmanship, the spice routes, the imports and exports of the 3 Guianas, the 3 cases of percentage, and other matters of rote given significance by the existence of bread lines and penthouses, just as the various drudgeries of their fathers were given dignity, even holiness, by their direct connection with food and survival. Although he would have been slow to admit this also, little Bech loved the school. He cherished his citizenship in its ragged population, was enraptured by the freckled chin and cerulean eyes of Eva Hassel across the aisle, and detested his mother's frequent interference in his American education. Whenever she appeared outside the office of the principal, Mr. Linehan, a sore-lidded, spoiled priest with an easily mimicked blink and stammer, he was teased in the cloakroom or down on the asphalt at recess. Whenever she had him skip a grade, he became all the more the baby of the class. By the age of 13, he was going to school with girls that were women. That day in May, he showed his anger with his mother by not talking to her as they walked from the scarred school steps down 78th, past a mock Tudor apartment house like some evilly enlarged and begrimed fairy tale chalet, to Broadway and 79th, and the IRT kiosk with its compounded aroma of hot breaks, warm bagels, and vomit. Extraordinarily, they took a train north. The whole drift of their lives was south to Times Square and to the public library, south to Gimbel's, south to Brooklyn, where his father's two brothers lived. North, there was nothing but Grant's Tomb and Harlem and Yankee Stadium and Riverdale, where a rich cousin, a theater manager, inhabited an apartment full of glass furniture and an array of leering and scribbled photographs. North of that yawned the foreign vastness, first named New York State, but melting westward into other names, other states, where the Goyim farmed their farms and drove their roadsters and swung on their porch swings and engaged in the countless struggles of moral heroism depicted continuously in the Hollywood movies at the Broadway RKO. Upon the huge body of the United States, swept by dust storms and storms of Christian conscience, young Henry knew that his island of Manhattan existed like a wart. Relatively, his little family world was an immigrant enclave. The religion his family practiced was a tolerated affront, and the language of this religion's celebration was a backwards-running archaism. He and his kin and their kindred were huddled in shawls within an overheated back room, while outdoors a huge and beautiful wilderness rattled their sashes with wind and painted the panes with frost. And all the furniture they had brought with them from Europe, the footstools and phylacteries, the copies of Tolstoy and Heine, the ambitiousness and defensiveness and love, belonged to this stuffy back room. Now his mother was pointing him north, into the cold. Their reflections shuddered in the black glass as the express train slammed through local stops, wan islands of light where fat-colored women waited with string shopping bags. Bech was always surprised that these frozen vistas did not shatter as they pierced them. Perhaps it was the multi-leveled sliding, the hurtling metal precariously switched aside from collision, more than the odors and subterranean claustrophobia that made the boy sick on subways. He figured that he was good for 8 stops before nausea began. It had just begun when she touched his arm. High, high on the west side, they emerged into a region where cliffs and windy hilltops seemed insecurely suppressed by the asphalt grid. A boisterous shout of spring rolled upward from the river, and unexpected bridges of green metal arched seraphically overhead. Together they walked, the boy and his mother, he in a wool knicker suit that scratched and sang between his legs, she in a tremulous hat of shining black straw, up a broad pavement bordered with cobblestones and trees whose bark was scabbed brown and white like a giraffe's neck. This was the last year when she was taller than he. His sideways glance reaped a child's cowing impression of, beneath the unsteady flesh of her jaw, the rose splotches at the side of her neck that signaled excitement or anger. He had better talk. "Where are we going?" "So," she said, "the cat found his tongue. You know I don't like your coming into the school." "Mr. Touch-me-not," she said. "So ashamed of his mother. He wants all his blue-eyed shixes to think he came out from under a rock, I suppose. Or better yet, lives in a tree like Siegfried." Somewhere in the past, she had wormed out of him his admiration of the German girls at school. He blushed. "Thanks to you," he told her, "they're all 2 years older than me." "Not in their empty golden heads, they're not so old. Maybe in their pants, but that'll come to you soon enough. Don't hurry the years. Soon enough they'll hurry you." Homily, flattery, and humiliation. These were what his mother applied to him day after day like a sculptor's pats. It deepened his blush to hear her mention Eva Hassel's pants. Were they what would come to him soon enough? This was her style, to mock his reality and stretch his expectations. "Mother, don't be fantastic." "Nothing fantastic." There's nothing one of those golden girls wouldn't like better than fasten herself to some smart little Jewish boy. Better that than some sausage-grinding Fritz who'll go to beer and beating her before he's 25. You keep your nose in your books. That's where it was. Where are you taking me? To see something more important than where to put your putts. Mother, don't be vulgar. Vulgar is what I call a boy who wants to put his mother under a rock. His mother and his people and his brain all under a rock. Now I understand. You're taking me to look at Plymouth Rock. Something like it. If you have to grow up American, at least let's not look only at the underside. Arnie, the Riverdale cousin, got me 2 tickets from Josh Glazer to I don't quite know what it is. We shall see. The hill beneath their feet flattened. They arrived at a massive building of somehow unsullied granite, with a paradoxical look of having been here forever, yet having been rarely used. Around its top ran a ribbon of carved names: Plato, Newton, Aeschylus, Leonardo, Aquinas, Shakespeare, Voltaire, Copernicus, Aristotle, Hobbes, Vico, Pushkin, Linnaeus, Racine, and infinitely on around cornices and down the receding length of the building's 2 tall wings. Courtyard followed courtyard, each at a slightly higher level than the last. Conical evergreens stood silent guard. An unseen fountain played. For entrance, there was a bewildering choice of bronze doors. Bech's mother pushed one and encountered a green-uniformed guard. She told him, "My name is Hannah Bech, and this is my son Henry. These are our tickets. It says right here, this is the day. They were obtained for us by a close associate of Josh Glazer's, the playwright. Nobody forewarned me it would be such a climb from the subway. That's why I'm out of breath like this." The guard, and then another guard, for they several times got lost, directed them, his mother receiving and repeating a full set of directions each time, up a ramifying series of marble stairways into the balcony of an auditorium whose ceiling, the child's impression was decorated with plaster toys, scrolls, masks, seashells, tops, and stars. A ceremony was already in progress. Their discussions with the guards had consumed time. The bright stage far below them supported a magical tableau. On a curved dais composed of 6 or 7 rows, 100 persons, mostly men, were seated. Though some of the men could be seen to move, one turned his head, another scratched his knee, their appearance in some had an iron unity. They looked engraved. Each face, even at the distance of the balcony, displayed the stamp of extra precision that devout attention and frequent photography etch upon a visage. Each had suffered the crystallization of fame. Young Henry saw that there were other types of heaven, less agitated and more elevated than the school, more compact and less tragic than Yankee Stadium, where the scattered players, fragile in white, seemed about to be devoured by the dragon-shaped crowd. He knew, even before his mother, with the aid of a diagram provided on her program, began to name names, that under his eyes was assembled the flower of the arts in America, its rabbis and chieftains, souls who, while still breathing, enjoyed their immortality. The surface of their collective glory undulated as one or another would stand, shuffle outward from his row, seize the glowing lectern, and speak. Some rose to award prizes, others rose to accept them. They applauded one another with a polite rustle eagerly echoed and thunderously amplified by the anonymous perishable crowd on the other side of the veil. A docile, cloudy multitude, stretching backwards from front rows of corsaged loved ones into the dim regions of the balcony where mere spectators sat, where little Bech stared, dazzled, while his mother busily bent above the identifying diagram. She located and pointed out to him, with that ardor for navigational detail that had delayed their arrival here, Emil Nordquist, the bard of the prairie, the beetle-browed celebrant in irresistible vers libre of shocked corn and Swedish dairy maids. John Kingsgrant Forbes, New England's dapper novelist of manners. Hannah Ann Collins, the wispy, mystical poet of impacted passion from Alabama, the most piquant voice in American verse since the passing of the Amherst recluse. The massive Jason Honeygale, Tennessee's fabled word torrent. Hawk-eyed Torquemada Languth, lover and singer of California's sheer cliffs and sere unpopulated places. And Manhattan's own Josh Glazer, Broadway wit, comedy right, lyricist, and Romeo. And there were squat, bald sculptors with great curved thumbs, red-bearded painters like bespattered prophets, petite, gleaming philosophers who piped Greek catchwords into the microphone, stooped and drawling historians from the border states, avowed communists with faces as dry as paper and black ribbons dangling from their pince-nez, atonal composers delicately exchanging awards and reminiscences of Paris. The phrases in French nasally cutting across their speech like accented trombones. Sibylline old women with bronze faces, all of them unified in the eyes of the boy Bech by not only the clothy dark mass of their clothes and the brilliance of the stage, but by their transcendence of time. They had attained the haven of lasting accomplishment and exempted themselves from the nagging nuisance of growth and its twin, which he precociously felt in himself even then, especially in his teeth, decay. He childishly assumed that, though unveiled every May, they sat like this eternally, in the same iron arrangement, beneath this domed ceiling of scrolls and stars. At last, the final congratulation was offered, and the final modest acceptance enunciated. Bech and his mother turned to renavigate the maze of staircases. They were both shy of speaking, but she sensed, in the abstracted way he clung to her side, neither welcoming nor cringing from her touch when she reached to reassure him in the crowd, that his attention had been successfully turned. His ears were red, showing that an inner flame had been lit. She set him on a track that must be, Mrs. Bech ignored a sudden qualm, like a rude jostling from behind, the right one. Bech never dared hope to join that pantheon. Those faces of the 30s, like the books he began to read, putting aside baseball statistics forever, formed a world impossibly high and apart. An immutable text, graven on the stone brow, his confused impression was, of Manhattan. In middle age, it would startle him to realize that Louis Bromfield, say, was no longer considered a sage, that Van Vechten, Cabell, and John Erskine had become as obscure as the famous gangsters of the same period, and that an entire generation had grown to wisdom without once chuckling over a verse by Arthur Gitterman or Franklin P. Adams. When Bech received in an envelope not so unlike those containing solicitations to join the Erotica Book Club or the Associated Friends of Apache Education, notice of his election to a society whose title suggested that of a merged church, with an invitation to its May ceremonial, he did not connect the honor with his truant afternoon of over 3 decades ago. He accepted because in his fallow middle years he hesitated to decline any invitation, whether it was to travel to communist Europe or to smoke marijuana. His working day was brief, his living day was long, and there always lurked the hope that around the corner of some impromptu acquiescence he would encounter, in a flurry of apologies and excitedly misaimed kisses, his long-lost mistress, Inspiration. He took a taxi north on the appointed day. By chance, he was let off at a side entrance, in no way reminiscent of the august frontal approach he had once ventured within the shadow of his mother. Inside the bronze door, Bech was greeted by a mini-skirted secretary who, licking her lips and perhaps unintentionally bringing her pelvis to within an inch of his, pinned his name in plastic to his lapel, and as a tantalizing afterthought, the tip of her tongue, exposed in playful concentration, adjusted the knot of his necktie. Other such considerate houris were supervising arrivals, separating antique belletrists from their overcoats with philatelic care, steering querulously nodding poetesses toward the elevator, administering the distribution of gaudy heaps of name tags, admission cards, and coded numerals. His girl wore a button that said, "God freaks out." Bech asked her, "Am I supposed to do anything?" She said, "When your name is announced, stand." "Do I take the elevator?" She patted his shoulders and tugged one of his earlobes. "I think you're a young enough body," she judged, "to take the stairs." He obediently ascended a thronged marble stairway and found himself amid a cloud of murmuring presences. A few of the faces were familiar. Tory Ingersoll, a tireless old fag, his prim features rigid in their carapace of orangish foundation, who had in recent years plugged himself into hipsterism and become a copious puffist and anthologist for the new poetry, whether concrete, non-associative, neo-Gita, or plain protest. Irving Stern, a swarthy, ruminative critic of Bech's age and background, who, for all his strenuous protests of McLuhanite openness, had never stopped squinting through the dour goggles of Leninist aesthetics, and whose own prose style tasted like aspirin tablets being chewed. Mildred Belousovsky-Demergue, her name as polyglot as her marriages, her weightlifter's shoulders and generous slash of a wise whore's mouth perversely dwindled in print to a trickle of elliptic dimeters. Char Ecton, the revolutionary young dramatist, whose foolish smile and high-pitched chortle consorted oddly with the facile bitterness of his denouements, but many more were half familiar, faces dimly known, like those of bit actors in B-movies, or like those faces which emerge from obscurity to cap a surprisingly enthusiastic obituary, or those names which figure small on title pages as translator, co-editor, or as told to. Faces whose air of recognizability might have been a matter of ghostly family resemblance, or of a cocktail party 10 years ago, or a PEN meeting, or of a moment in a bookstore, an inside flap hastily examined and then resealed into the tight, bright row of the unpurchased. In this throng, Bech heard his name softly called and felt his sleeve lightly plucked. But he did not lift his eyes for fear of shattering the spell, of disturbing the penumbral decorum and rustle around him. They came to the end of their labyrinthine climb and were ushered down a dubiously narrow corridor. Bech hesitated, as even the dullest steer hesitates in the slaughterer's chute, but the pressure behind moved him on, outward, into a spotlit tangle of groping men and scraping chairs. He was on a stage. Chairs were arranged in curved tiers. Mildred Belousovsky-Demergue waved an alabaster, muscular arm. "You, Henry, over here. Come be a bee with me." She even spoke now, so thoroughly does art corrupt the artist, in dimeters. Willingly, he made his way upwards toward her. Always in his life, no matter how underfurnished in other respects, there had been a woman to shelter beside. The chair beside her bore his name. On the seat of the chair was a folded program. On the back of the program was a diagram. The diagram fitted a memory, and looking outward into the populated darkness that reached backwards into a balcony, beneath a ceiling dimly decorated with toy-like protrusions of plaster, Bech suspected at last where he was. With the instincts of a literary man, he turned to printed matter for confirmation. He bent over the diagram and, yes, found his name, his number, his chair. He was here. He had joined that luminous, immutable tableau. He had crossed to the other side. Now that forgotten expedition with his mother returned to him, and their climb through those ramifications of marble, a climb that mirrored, but profanely, the one he had just taken within sacred precincts. And he deduced that this building was vast twice over, an arch-like interior meeting in this domed auditorium where the mortal and the immortal could behold one another through a veil that blurred and darkened the one and gave to the other a supernatural visibility, the glow and precision of Platonic forms. He studied his left hand, his partner in numerous humble crimes, his delegate in many furtive investigations, and saw it partaking, behind the flame-blue radiance of his cuff, joint by joint, to the quicks of his fingernails, in the fine articulation found less in reality than in the Promethean anatomical studies of Leonardo and Raphael. Bech looked around. The stage was filling. He seemed to see down front, where the stage light was most intense, the oft photographed, by Steichen, by Karsch, by Cartier-Bresson, profile and vivid corn-silk hair of it couldn't be, Emil Nordquist. The bard of the prairie still lived. He must be 100. No, well, if in the mid-30s he was in his mid-40s, he would be only 80 now. While Bech, that pre-adolescent, was approaching 50, time had treated him far more cruelly. And now, through the other wing of the stage, from the elevator side, moving with the agonized shuffle step of a semi-paralytic, but still sartorially formidable in double-breasted chalk stripes and a high starched collar, entered John Kingsgrant Forbes, whose last perceptive and urbane examination of Beacon Hill mores had appeared in World War II during the paper shortage. Had Bech merely imagined his obituary? "Arriveth our queen," Mildred Belossovsky-Domergue sardonically murmured on his left, with that ambiguous trace of a foreign accent, the silted residue of her several husbands. And to Bech's astonishment, in came, supported on the courtly arm of Jason Honeygale, whose epic bulk had shriveled to folds of veined hide draped over stegosaurian bones, the tiny, tottering figure of Hannah Ann Collins, wearing the startled facial expression of the blind. She was led down front, where the gaunt figure of Torquemada Langouth, his spine bent nearly double, his falconine crest now white as an egret's, rose to greet her and feebly to adjust her chair. Bech murmured leftwards, "I thought they were all dead." Mildred airily answered, "We find it easier not to die." A shadow plumped brusquely down in the chair on Bech's right. It was, oh, monstrous, Josh Glazer. His proximity seemed to be a patron's, for he told Bech windily, "Jesus Christ, Bech, I've been plugging you for years up here, but the bastards always said, let's wait until he writes another book. That last one was such a flop. Finally, I say to them, look, the son of a bitch, he's never going to write another book. So they say, okay, let's let him the hell in. Welcome aboard, Bech. Christ, I've been a raving fan of yours since the year one. When are you going to try a comedy? Broadway's dead on its feet." He was deaf, his hair was dyed black, and his teeth were false too, for his blasts of breath carried with them a fetid smell of trapped alcohol, and of a terrible organic something that suggested to Bech, touching a peculiar fastidiousness that was all that remained of his ancestors' orthodoxy, the stench of decayed shellfish. Bech looked away and saw everywhere on the stage disillusion and riot. The furrowed skulls of philosophers lolled in a Bacchic stupor. Wicked smirks flickered back and forth among faces enshrined in textbooks. Eustace Chubb, America's poetic conscience throughout the Cold War, had holes in his socks and mechanically chafed a purple sore on his shin. Anatole Husach, the father of neo-figurism, was sweating out a drug high, his hands twitching like suffocating fish. As the ceremony proceeded, not a classroom of trade school dropouts could have been more impudently inattentive. Mildred Belossovsky-Domergue persistently tickled the hairs on Bech's wrist with the edge of her program. Josh Glazer offered him a sip from a silver flask signed by the Gershwin brothers. The leonine head, that of a great lexicographer directly in front of Bech, drifted sideways and emitted illegible snores. The medal for modern fiction was being awarded to Kingsgrant Forbes. The cello-shaped critic, best known for his scrupulous editorship of the 6 volumes of Hamlin Garland's correspondence, began his speech. "In these sorry days of so-called black humor, of the fictional apotheosis of the underdeveloped, and a Negro in the middle of Bech's row stood, spoke a single black expletive, and, with much scraping of chairs, made his way from the stage. A series of grants was bestowed. One of the recipients, a tiptoeing fellow in a mauve jumpsuit, hurled paper streamers toward the audience and bared his chest to reveal painted there a psychedelic pig labeled Millhouse. At this, several old men, an Arizona naturalist and a New Deal muralist, stamped off, and for a long time could be heard buzzing for the elevator. The sardonic hubbub waxed louder. Impatience set in. "God damn it," Josh Glazer breathed to Bech. "I'm paying a limousine by the hour downstairs. Jesus, and I've got a hell of a cute little fox waiting for me at the plaza." At last, the time came to introduce the new members. The citations were read by a far-sighted landscape painter who had trouble bringing his papers, the lectern light, and his reading glasses into mutual adjustment at such short focus. "Henry Bech," he read, pronouncing it Bech, and Bech confusedly stood. The spotlights dazzled him. He had the sensation of being microscopically examined, and of being strangely small. When he stood, he had expected to rear into a man's height, and instead rose no taller than a child. "A native New Yorker," the citation began, "who has chosen to sing of the continental distances." Bech wondered why writers in official positions were always supposed to sing. He couldn't remember the last time he had even hummed. "A son of Israel, loyal to Melville's romanticism." He went around telling interviewers Melville was his favorite author, but he hadn't gotten a third of the way through Pierre. "A poet in prose whose polish precludes pardon me, these are new bifocals." Laughter from the audience. Who was out there in that audience? "Let me try again. Whose polish precludes profligacy." His mother was out there in that audience. "A magician of metaphor." She was there, right down front, basking in the reflected stage light, an orchid corsage pinned to her bosom. "And a friend of the human heart." But she had died 4 years ago in a nursing home in Riverdale. As the applause washed in, Bech saw that the old lady with the corsage was applauding only politely. She was not his mother, but somebody else's. Maybe of the boy with the pig on his stomach, though for a moment, a trick of the light, something determined and expectant in the tilt of her head, something hopeful. The light in his eyes turned to warm water. His applause ebbed away. He sat down. Mildred nudged him. Josh Glazer shook his hand too violently. Bech tried to clear his vision by contemplating the backs of the heads. They were blank. Blank, shabby backs of a cardboard tableau, lent substance only by the credulous, by old women and children. His knees trembled as if after an arduous climb. He had made it. He was here, in heaven. Now what? Appendix A. We are grateful for permission to reprint corroborating excerpts from the unpublished Russian journal of Henry Bech. The journal physically is a faded red expenses diary, measuring 7 3/8 inches by 4 1/4 inches, stained by Moscow brandy and warped by Caucasian dew. The entries, of which the latter are kept in red ballpoint pen, run from October 20th, 1964 to December 6th, 1964. The earliest are the fullest. 1. October 20th. Flight from New York at midnight. No sleep. Pan Am kept feeding me. Beating against the sun, soon dawn. Paris strange passing through by bus, tattered, tired sepia sets of second-rate opera being wheeled through, false cheer of cafe awnings, waiting for chorus of lamplighters. Orly to Les Bourgets. Moscow plain a new world. Men in dark coats waiting bunched, solemn as gangsters. Overhead, first understood Russian word, Amerikansky, pronounced with wink toward me by snaggle-toothed gent, putting bulky black coat in overhead rack. Rack netted cord, inside ribs of plain show, no capitalist plastic. Stewardesses, not our smoothly extruded tarts, but hefty flesh, served us real potatoes, beef sausage, borscht. I'er afloat a feast afloat. Crowded, happy stable smell. Animal heat in cold stable 5 miles up. Uncle's back rooms in Williamsburg. Babble around me. Foreign languages strangely soothing at home in Babel. Fell asleep on bosom of void, grateful to be alive, home. Woke in dark again. Earth's revolution full in my face. Moscow dim on ocean of blackness. Delicate torn veil, shy of electricity. Not New York, that rude splash. Premonition, no one will meet. Author disappears behind iron curtain. Bech best remembered for early work. A delegation with roses waiting for me on other side of glass pen. Wait for hours on verge of Russia. Decompressing, time different here. Steps of time. Long, dully lit terminal, empty of ads. Limousine driven by voiceless back of head. Sleigh driver in Tolstoy. Long haul to Moscow. A wealth of darkness. Gray birches. Slim, young, far from gnarled American woods. In hotel, spelled out étage, waiting for elevator. French hidden beneath the Cyrillic. Everywhere, secrets. 2. October 23rd. Met Sabaka, head of Writers' Union. Building Tolstoy's old manse. Dining room baronial oak. Litterateurs live like aristocrats. Sabaka has lipless mouth, wild bark, must have strangled men with bare hands. Tells me long story of love of his poetry expressed by coal miner in the Urals. Skip translating. Then here in the deepest part of the mine, by only the light of carbon lights in the miners' caps, for 3 hours I recited, from the works of my youth, lyrics of the fields and forests of Byelorussia. Never have I known such enthusiasm. Never have I possessed such inspiration, such powers of memory. At the end, they wept to see me depart. These simple miners, their coal-blackened faces streaked, veined with the silver of tears. Fantastic, I say. Fantastichny, Skip translates. Sabaka makes Skip ask me if I like the image, their faces of coal veined with silver.